Hi everyone. I wanted to give you some tips about taking notes while watching and listening to this voiceover PowerPoint. Of course, you know the stuff that's written on the slide is important, but the things that I lecture about that are not on the slide is the stuff that you really need to take notes on. I guarantee you that there will be some information that I talk about that is not on the slide that you will see on your next exam. So really pay attention while you're listening to these. Don't just read them. Be sure and listen to the lecture too. I hope that this format will not be too terribly intolerable for you, but I think this is probably better than just reading a PowerPoint. At least I hope it is. I hope that you get more out of it than simply reading a PowerPoint. Okay, have fun. I'll see you on Tuesday. Theories of crime try to answer at least one of the following three questions. First, they want to know things like, why are some people more likely than others to commit crime? Is there some sort of difference among people that makes them more predisposed to committing crime? Next, theories of crime, sociological theories of crime, want to know, why are some categories of people more likely than others to commit crime? So why are some racial groups, for example, more likely to commit crime or certain types of crime than others? Why are men more likely to commit crime than women? And then third, they ask, why is crime more common in some locations than in others? Why is crime more common in urban areas than in rural areas? Things like that. Now, demonological or supernatural explanations of criminality dominated thinking from early history well into the 18th century age of enlightenment. In a system of knowledge in which the church provided the only explanation of reality, the criminal was viewed as a sinner who was possessed by demons or who was damned by otherworldly forces or damned by God. So humankind was viewed as being at the mercy of the supernatural. They believed in things like fate and ghosts and spirits. So felonies, or mortal sins, were viewed as the manifestation of evil in human form. So you can think about things like the Prince of Darkness or some expression of God's divine wrath. So people in ancient times were thought to act deviantly for several reasons. God was testing their faith. God was punishing them. God was using their behavior to warn others to follow him. Or even that they were possessed by demons. So think about the Salem witch trials and Spanish Inquisition. These things serve as examples of the torture, hanging, burning at the stake, and other types of torture that awaited heretics and criminals. And this point of view is that actors' behaviors were deterministically controlled by factors outside of or beyond their control. Now, while these types of religious explanations have predominated history, in the West, these were gradually rejected during and following the Enlightenment. Now, what unites all modern explanations is their rejection of theodicy. And these are religious explanations for evil. Stanford Lyman first labeled sociodicy as a naturalistic effort to explain the ways of man-to-man evil. So evil and suffering now are explained as the result of worldly rather than otherworldly forces. This includes both free will and positivistic explanations. Religious views began to give way in the 1700s with the rise of scientific explanations. And during this time, the Age of Reason, or the Enlightenment period, challenged medieval beliefs about God controlling all human behavior and that the church's authority should only be accepted as law. So philosophers during this era argued that God had left humans to govern their own affairs through free will and through reason. In their view, people rationally calculate rewards and risks of behavior. People adopt behaviors that give them the greatest reward or pleasure with the least pain. Now, despite this new enlightened thinking, punitive punishments were rampant throughout Europe. People were arrested on heresy and imprisoned without trial. Torture was used to elicit confessions and to name the names of other people who engaged in similar types of behaviors. People were even pressed to death during this time, so they were either crushed immediately or even slowly as a form of punishment. Cesare Beccaria, who is widely regarded as the father of classical criminological theory, he authored a book entitled On Crimes and Punishments, and this was essentially a treatise that helped found the classical school of criminology. So Beccaria was appalled at the conditions of the European criminal justice system in the 18th century. He argued that because people have free will, because he was an Enlightenment thinker, law need only be as punitive as it takes to deter people from committing crime. So Beccaria clearly takes a utilitarian stance. For Beccaria, the purpose of punishment is to create a better society. It doesn't have anything to do with revenge. Punishment serves to deter others from committing crimes and to prevent the criminal from repeating their crime in the future. Now, he outwardly condemned practices such as torture and punishments that were harsher than the crime. He also was opposed to the death penalty. In fact, his motto, or a summation of his position, might be something to the effect of, "Let the punishment fit the crime." Now, during the same time, English philosopher Jeremy Bentham argued similarly, that law was more severe than it needed to be to keep rational people from committing crime. And he asserted that people often use a cost-benefit analysis to guide their behavior. Now, interestingly, prior to this time, long-term incarceration did not exist, only short-term jail sentences. Now, Bentham was influential in the development of the modern police force in England, and his ideas helped shape the idea of the modern prison that we know now in America. One of the things that he's most famous for is the idea of the panopticon. Panopticon. And panopticon means all-seeing. It's a theory of surveillance that he actually made into an actual prison design. So this prison design functions as a round-the-clock surveillance machine. Its design ensured that no prisoner could ever see the inspector or the guard who was surveilling them from a privileged central location within a radial configuration, within a circular type of building. So there could be maybe a prison guard in the center of the circular prison and then cells all around the circular outside wall. The prisoner would never know when he was being surveilled, and this mental uncertainty that in itself would prove to be a crucial instrument of discipline became very widely known. Now, the American prison systems in the late 18th and 19th centuries utilized this notion of the panopticon. We actually built some prisons that were similar to this. Jeremy Bentham's design allowed all prisoners also to see each other. So think about the word panopticon. Pan means all, optic means to see or observe. And therefore, this reduced the duty and the necessity of the prison guards. So the prisoners being able to see each other all the time acted as an additional sort of informal social control. So the original panopticon got the prisoners to work menial jobs while all in each other's lines of sight and turned the watched and the watchers into one. French philosopher Michel Foucault argues that the psychological effects of this process, this panopticon, can be transposed onto society. So in modern disciplinary systems, such as schools, yes, we can think of schools as being disciplinary systems. Schools, armies, factories, hospitals, these are all created to observe and normalize society. So he who misbehaves is seen doing so. And in turn, he who sees the misbehavior knows that if he can see it happening, someone can also see him. Now, this poses questions of whether a society under surveillance can actually be a happy, healthy, and productive society. Now, you don't need to memorize these, but I do want you to read them and listen to them as I read them too. These are the 12 primary principles that Cesare Beccaria helped inspire change in the correctional and prison environment. So he said back in the 1800s that laws should only be used to maintain the social contract, that only legislators should create laws, that judges should impose punishment only in accordance with the law. Judges should not interpret the laws. Punishment should be based on the pleasure-pain principle. Punishment should be based on the quantity or quality of the act, not the actor, not the characteristics of the actor. The punishment should also be determined by the crime. Punishment should be prompt and should be effective. All people should be treated equally. Capital punishment should be abolished. The use of torture to feign confessions should be abolished. And most importantly, he argued that it is better to prevent crimes than to punish them. Now, just a few criticisms of Beccaria's principles, because for the most part, these are what we should, I think, be paying attention to. This is how we should be operating our current system. But a couple criticisms of this is that while the classical school of criminology led to reform throughout Europe, it's still criticized as being a little too simplistic. Current criminologists argue that yes, people do sometimes weigh the benefits and the consequences, but sometimes they act emotionally. Sometimes they act irrationally, and they don't really think about the consequences. They don't predetermine their behavior. So people don't always have the same perception of what's pleasurable either. And finally, classical reformers, while they argue that all people be treated the same, they completely overlook the possibility of racism or sexism and class differences as making a real difference in treatment and sentencing and outcomes for people. One final criticism of the classical school of thought is that classical scholars failed to recognize that other forces, those outside of the individual, might have an impact on behavior. Now, this was central to a new way of thinking about the world, positivism. And positivism as a way of thinking. One final criticism of the classical school of thought is that classical scholars failed to recognize that other forces, those outside of the individual, might have an impact on behavior. Now, this was central to a new way of thinking about the world, positivism. And positivism as a way of thinking dominated thought throughout the 19th century, and it influenced the work of physical scientists too, like Galileo and Newton. Positivism was largely founded by French social philosopher Auguste Comte. And Comte argued that human behavior is influenced by factors outside of the individual, beyond the individual's control, which is the primary focus of sociology. Now, beyond the individual's control could mean supernatural, but he's saying that no, it's not the supernatural, it's social conditions outside of the individual's control. Biological and physical explanations and psychological explanations place the cause of crime inside the individual, usually due to some type of dysfunction. So while positivism still influences some modern theories of crime, some critics point out a few shortcomings. First, they generally don't question the state's definition of crime. So positivists overlook the possibility that ruling groups get to define crime as it best suits them. Next, positivists tend to assert that criminals are abnormal. There's something wrong with them when we explain their behavior as being different from or due to social or psych or bio factors. We create an us and them. So there are non-criminals are normal and criminals are inferior. But what we find in self-report studies is that there's a very, very fine line, behaviors that are deemed acceptable or criminal. We all walk this line. So biological and psychological explanations focus within the individual and place the cause of crime inside the individual. Neoclassical and sociological explanations tend to focus on categories of people and locations, and they tend to place the cause of crime outside of the individual. Now, you've heard me refer to neoclassical theory. Well, what does neo mean? Neoclassical, neorealist, neofascist. Well, neo means new. So neo anything very broadly means a newer explanation. Now, as I mentioned before, Cesar Beccaria and other classical theorists described human behavior as a result of weighing pleasure and pain. Now, a twist on this classical perspective, which combines early classical thought with an economic model of rational decision making, neoclassical, is rational choice theory. Now, around the early 1960s, economist Gary Becker developed a utility or utilitarian model of criminality. He introduced a cost-benefit analysis of crime and argued that individuals freely choose crime based on their estimate or their likelihood of getting caught. But now, Cornish and Clark make a similar argument and build on this. They say that offenders also consider opportunity along with the cost and benefits of committing certain crimes. So if the benefits outweigh the costs and the opportunity presents itself, people have little holding them back from doing whatever it is that they want, including things that are criminal or deviant. Now, there are a lot of assumptions that are made by rational choice theory about people who engage in rational choice. And first, it assumes that individuals are motivated by the desires or the goals that express their preferences for the things that they want or desire. That's their reason for doing things. Next, it's that they act on the basis of the information that they have about the conditions under which they are acting, so they may or may not have all of the necessary information to make an informed or a rational choice. Third, rational choice theory assumes that it's not possible for individuals to achieve all of the various things that they want. So there are plenty of things that we want, but we simply can't have everything we want. I think most of us know this. Fourth, they must make choices in relation to both their goals and the means for attaining these goals. Next, rational choice theories hold that individuals must anticipate the outcomes of alternative courses of action and calculate which choice will be the best for them. And then finally, the theory assumes that rational individuals choose the alternative that is likely to give them the greatest satisfaction. According to this diagram, there are two different paths for making this rational choice. The first path, depicted on the left side of the diagram, begins with background factors. And these are things like psychological characteristics like intelligence, family background, demographic factors, like what kind of neighborhood the criminal comes from. And then next we go down and we have to take into consideration their level of skill and experience. So this refers to any previous success they've had with similar targets, or with the criminal's own self-perception of their own skills, their perceived ability to elude law enforcement, and then maybe their ability to even get rid of the merchandise or something afterwards. And then next we go down to whether or not they have all of the necessary skill and experience, situational factors. And these are things like persuasion by friends. So if you have arguments with a spouse, or whether the person has consumed alcohol or drugs, these things can fast track someone into committing a crime. And if they do not necessarily have the experience, then they have to be motivated to commit crime. The amount of effort required fits into this as the amount of time spent considering and evaluating whether the rewards and costs of a crime outweigh alternative avenues for satisfying the same needs. Now, the person must also assess blocked opportunities, and this is the criminal's assessment of what legitimate avenues are available for satisfying their needs. The decision has to be made as to whether the same amount of money, for example, can be made by working, or by gambling, or borrowing, or maybe even some other type of avenue other than crime. If it can't be achieved and the person is ready to take the risk, then they will choose to commit the crime. Now, the alternate path for making the decision to commit crime, depicted on the right side of the diagram, begins again with the same background factors, and then the criminal or potential criminal considering their need for money or for status, respect, things like that. Then they must assess, again, blocked opportunities, if there are indeed any legitimate avenues available for satisfying their needs. If not, and the person is ready to take the risk, then they will likely choose to commit the crime. Now, rational choice theorists also recognize that the threat of punishment or the promise of reward may motivate people just as much as the actual punishment that's inflicted or the reward itself. So threats and promises are very powerful motivators too. The rational calculation of a threat would lead offenders to avoid committing a crime. And this is where deterrence theory comes in. Possible offenders can be deterred from committing crime if the consequences seem too severe. Now, this perspective shifts attention to the act of engaging in criminal or deviant activity. The issue becomes what can be done to make the act or the crime or deviance less attractive to the individual? How can the crime or deviant behavior under consideration be prevented? So strategies that are relevant to this perspective include preventative measures like target hardening, such as deadbolts, self-defense skills, the club, neighborhood watch programs, things like that. And then legal deterrence, like adding more police. And then by enabling severely punitive policies, like mandatory sentencing, 3 strikes policies, the death penalty, etc. Deterrence theory states that if legal penalties are certain, swift, and severe, crime will be deterred. So these are the 3 ingredients for deterrence: certainty, severity, and swift punishment. Now, how do we measure certainty? Well, certainty of punishment is defined as the ration between the number of admissions to the state prisons for a given crime and the number of the known crimes to police. Severity of punishment is defined as the average or mean number of months served by all prisoners convicted of a given crime who were in prison for that year. And then, of course, swift sentencing means swiftly responding to the alleged crime and sentencing in a timely manner. Because we find that the more immediate the threat of punishment, the more a person will actually rationalize and think about whether or not to commit a crime, especially if it's a crime of passion. So there's this conflict between this immediate need to relieve pain in some awful way versus quickly thinking about a possible jail sentence years down the road after a long trial. If we know with certainty that the punishment is going to happen right away, then we might be more likely to consider the consequences according to deterrence theory. Now, there are a couple more key concepts to understanding deterrence theory. First is the idea of general deterrence, and this means that members of the public decide not to break the law because they fear punishment. So norms, laws, and enforcement are to be designed and implemented to produce and maintain the image that negative or disruptive behaviors will receive attention and will receive punishment. Although specific individuals become the object of enforcement activities, general deterrence theory focuses on reducing the probability of deviance in the general population, so on a very wide scale. So examples of social control activities used in deterrence include things like drunk driving crackdowns on New Year's Eve, crime task forces and special police units, publication and highly visible notices of laws and policies. Like, think about when you go into a store and you see a sign about shoplifting. There's a notice: shoplifters will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. And then, of course, there are things like the death penalty. That's a pretty general deterrence, or is supposed to be. Now, general deterrence strategies focus on future behaviors, like preventing people from engaging in crime by impacting their rational decision-making process. Specific deterrence focuses on punishing known deviants or known offenders in order to prevent them from ever again violating the specific norm that they have broken. And the concern here is that motives and rationales that lie behind the original behavior can sometimes never be completely eradicated. But through punishment as a negative sanction, problematic behavior can be extinguished. For example, shock sentencing, corporal punishment, mandatory arrests for certain behaviors like domestic violence. These are all examples of policies that deal with specific deterrence. Now, within the concept of specific deterrence is the idea that punishment must be effective, and this is called incapacitation. Most punishment in the modern societies involves imprisonment, which is incapacitation, and research demonstrates that recidivism among convicted felons following release from prison is as high as 63%, and that most prison inmates had arrest records and convictions prior to their current offense. So the conclusion to achieve this, at least through a deterrence perspective, is to incarcerate, to incapacitate. Current policies acknowledge that prison may not prevent future crime, at least for most people, but it does reduce the chance of people committing crime because they're locked up. So basically, we lock them up, we throw away the key. And we have plenty of policies like this, truth in sentencing policies, and these require offenders to serve at least 85% of a sentence before they can be eligible for parole, and elimination of parole for other crimes like 3 strikes and you're out. Then there's this idea of retribution or retributive theory. And this simply means that if criminals choose to engage in disruptive and threatening behaviors, they deserve to be punished. They're criminals, so they deserve punishment, whatever they get. The focus here is not on the future and not on what the individual may do. It's not concerned with prevention. It's not concerned with rehabilitation. The aim here is to punish people for what they have done. Punish all individuals who violate the same norm in the same way, no exceptions, and no mercy. This is a policy that we accept pretty broadly throughout the United States, or at least have in the past. And what we're finding is that it's causing lots and lots and lots of consequences for lots of people. A researcher by the name of Sherman asked people about their perception of the risk of being punished for specific offenses and whether they might have actually committed those offenses if they had thought thoroughly about the consequences. And he found a consistent association between offending and the perception of certainty. So they did think about the consequences if they were certain that they would be punished, but there was no association between offending and the perception of severity. So it didn't matter how severe the people thought the punishment might be unless they thought it was certain. So if you're sure you'll get caught and will do time, it may impact your choice to participate in a crime. But the severity of the punishment has little effect. So a 1-year jail sentence versus a 5-year jail sentence is not going to deter someone from committing a crime. Now, interestingly, another study by Nagin in 1990 claimed that repeat offenders are less afraid of imprisonment. So if we're using prison and we're using sentence to try to deter people from crime, it doesn't seem to be working. Now, in Tittle's 1992 study, he found that states with the death penalty have higher murder rates than states without it. And the reason is that the death penalty is implemented in those states where murder rate is really high. There's this unclear causation. So you would think that if the death penalty was supposed to serve as a deterrent, that states where there was a lot of death penalty stuff being, on the news and people being subjected to it all the time, that there would be fewer homicides in those states. But the reverse is happening. And in fact, some researchers, Bonner and Fessenden in 2000, found that the death penalty actually increases homicides in those states. So the death penalty has what they call a brutalization effect. Brutalization effect. And that tends to devalue human life and thereby increase homicide shortly after a death penalty or after someone is put to death by the state. Now, a major presumption of deterrence theory is that higher arrest and imprisonment should produce lower crime rates. But this pattern often does not occur. Sometimes crime rates decline only slightly, Sometimes they don't change at all. Sometimes they even increase, as they did throughout the 1980s. And interestingly, although crime rates did begin decreasing after the beginning of the big 1980s boom and the early 90s imprisonment boom, crime declined less in states with the highest imprisonment rates. The reverse happened. Now, the greatest criticism of this rational choice deterrence model is that numerous studies find that many criminals do not plan their crimes. So studies of active robbers, burglars, and other offenders find that there are unique differences between the three, and that other factors are involved in whether or not they commit their offenses, like need, coercion, and even the effects of drugs and alcohol. And many act impulsively and fully fail to consider any negative consequences. Now, another neoclassical perspective, based on rational choice and decision-making, is routine activity theory. And we briefly talked about the idea of routine activities affecting the possibility of being a victim of a crime in Chapter 4. But we can apply this more specifically to criminals, too. Routine activity theory states that in order for a crime to be committed, 3 specific criteria must be met. First, there has to be a motivated offender. There has to be someone who's willing to commit a crime. Next, there has to be a suitable target. What would be a suitable target of, say, a robbery? Are you going to rob a really huge guy? Probably not. And then third, there has to be the absence of a capable guardian. So there can't be police officers around, or parents, or somebody that might smack you down. Now, this theory attempts to show that crime rates are not generally affected by big, gigantic macro changes like economic recessions and unemployment rates. For example, while researching crime rates after World War II, it was discovered that even though America was economically prospering compared to the pre-war depression, crime rates were still high, and they showed no signs of decreasing. And the general lifestyle of individuals plays an important part in this definition of routine activities theory. So the more one is exposed to criminal behavior in their everyday life, the higher the likelihood is that a person will commit criminal activity, and the higher likelihood that they'll also be a victim of criminal activity. Now, in 1979, Lawrence Cohen and Marcus Felsen constructed a study testing routine activities theory, and they found that in general, for crime to happen, offenders, targets, and the absence of guardians must all converge at the same time and in the same location for someone to commit a crime. So when people's routine activities change, crime rates change as well. There will always be a supply of motivated offenders, though. We might ask how we can apply routine activities theory when there are changes in crime rates. So if we focus on changes in the supply of attractive targets, and in the presence or absence of guardianship as the key variables affecting changes in crime rates, this theory can still be effectively applied. We just have to focus on the criminal opportunity structure and opportunity theories of crime. Now, interestingly, routine activities inside or near one's home results in less victimization than in activities that occur away from people's home. So finally, crime results in part from the activities that so many people ordinarily enjoy. And here's a quote about routine activities theory. Rather than assuming that predatory crime is simply an indicator of social breakdown, one might take it as a byproduct of freedom and prosperity as they manifest themselves in the routine activities of everyday life. Now, routine activities theory is popular because it seems to explain important aspects of differences in crime rates among different categories of people and among different locations. Why young people, for example, are more likely to commit crime or be victimized by crime. Why older people are less likely. It seems also to explain important aspects of changes in crime rates over time. Now, certain studies have deepened the understanding of the factors that contribute to target availability in the absence of guardianship. So, studies of these types of things around routine activities theory have been very influential. Some researchers have used it to explain offending, as we have done today. Now, a problem here, and really the most significant criticism, I guess, of this theory, is that it ignores other factors that motivate offenders to commit crime, like poverty. And then finally, we can think in terms of situational crime prevention and efforts in specific locations that aim to reduce exposure to motivated offenders, to decrease target suitability, and increase capable guardianship are sometimes used to try to prevent crime that happens as a result of routine activities. And some examples of these types of things are like installing increased lighting and camera surveillance on city streets and in public parks, providing or installing better security systems for motor vehicles, commercial buildings, and in homes, and then things like hotspot policing.